Hey, this is Mr. Shanahan for Magnet Sociology. We're talking about Chapter 16, Population and Urbanization. First, we're going to start out talking about the case studies about how megacities are built and designed. Section 1 is population change. Section 2 is on urban life. And Section 3 is urban ecology. The lab will be applying what we've learned. So, enormous cities such as Sao Paulo, Brazil are considered megacities or urban areas with population of more than 10 million. More than 280 million people live in the world's 25 megacities. People flock to these cities for work, but a large population centers face challenges in providing transportation, energy, healthcare, and law enforcement. In the ancient world, cities rarely could be larger than a day's walk across. Now they are enormous. Tokyo, Japan has 34,450,000 people. Mexico City has 18,066,000 people. New York City has 17,846 people. Sao Paulo, Brazil, 17,099,000 people. Mumbai, India, 16,086,000 people. With a population of about 17 million, Sao Paulo is one of the largest megacities in the world. Section 1. Population change. There are three factors affecting the growth or decline of a region's population: the birth rate, the death rate, and the rate of migration. In the late 1700s, Thomas Malthus predicted that populations around the world would continue to grow rapidly. His theory also stated that a rapidly growing population would outpace food production, which would cause famine. Population change. Because the demographic transition theory considers society's level of technological development, most demographers favor the theory of Malthusian to the Malthusian theory. Many countries around the world have adopted strategies aimed at controlling their population, such as family planning and economic improvements. So the main idea of this section is that the world's population is constantly changing, and demographers study these changes and apply theories to try to explain these changes. So at the end of this section, you should be able to answer, how do demographers study world population change? What theories attempt to explain population change? And why do some countries want to control population growth? The rapid population growth of recent years has had a tremendous effect on social life, population number of people living in the area at a particular time. Demography, the study of human populations. The world population of about 4 babies are born in the world every second. As a result, providing food and services to growing populations become a challenge to many countries. There are 6.7 billion people in the world population in 2008. 9 billion is projected to be the world population for 2040. The number one is China's population, ranking in 2008 with a population of 1.3 billion people, with India close behind. With 304 million is the population of the United States. In 2008, it was the number 3 in world rankings in population. Interpreting the data, what is the projected world population for 2040? And what do you think the impact of that population increase might be? Birth rate. The annual number of live births per 1,000 members of population. The U.S. birth rate is 14.6 people per 1,000. The fertility number of births occurring to women of childbearing age. Fecundity is the biological capability to bear children. Women have a biological capacity to bear between 15 and 30 children in the course of their lifetime, but most women won't produce anywhere near that number. Death rate. When we talk about the death rate, we're referring to the number of deaths per 1,000 members of a population. The U.S. rate is 8.5 people die for every 1,000. The various kinds of death can be calculated to more accurately depict a society's death rate. Infant mortality rate is the number of deaths among infants under 1 year of age per 1,000. Industrialized countries have a much lower infant mortality rate than do non-industrialized countries due to health care and social services, sanitation, and other types of public services that are available. Life expectancy is the average number of years that a person born in a particular year can expect to live. Here again, industrialized nations typically have a longer lifespan than the non-industrialized countries for the same reason as infant mortality. The increased healthcare opportunities, improved transportation, sanitation, and technology. The migration rate is the movement of people from one area of the world to another. Migration rate of the annual number of people who move into a specified area per 1,000 members of that area's population. Push factors that encourage people to move out of a place. Examples would be persecution, famine, racial discrimination, overpopulation, warfare, things that would make you try to flee a country. Crime, for instance. Many of the countries in Central America now have rampant crime problems, and many of the people are fleeing to other parts of the world, like the United States, in an effort to escape these conditions. Pull factors are factors that encourage people to move into a place. Example, religious and political freedom, economic opportunities, and a high standard of living. Because the United States has one of the richest standard of living in the world, it causes many people to want to come here to be able to work because of the opportunities and economic conditions. Not to mention, we also have religious and political freedoms where people are oftentimes persecuted. Many of the people, for instance, many of the Jewish people of the world, of Europe, fled to the United States as a way of escaping the Russian pogroms or the Nazis in the early half of the 20th century. Likewise, other pull factors here in the United States are historically have been, like, for instance, when the gold rush took place, or where people would suddenly move from the eastern United States to the western United States in an effort to get rich or to get the free land that was available for farming. So all these are pull factors that bring people to that part of the world. The growth rate is at which a country's population is increasing is calculated by subtracting the death rate from the birth rate and is usually expressed as a percentages. The U.S. rate is 0.6%, meaning that about 6 people were added to the population for every 1,000 members. The growth rates in more developed countries are typically lower. A population growth rate of only 1% will cause the population to double in size in approximately 70 years. Population composition is the structure of the population. The age and sex are factors most often used to show composition of a population. The population pyramid are graphic representations of age, sex, distribution, and of a population. Demographers use population pyramids to help make predictions about the future of population needs, such as healthcare. So let's analyze some population statistics. The U.S. Bureau is the government agency, the U.S. Census Bureau is the government agency authorized to collect, tabulate, publish statistical information about the population of the United States. The Bureau conducts a nationwide survey of population every 10 years. What can you learn by analyzing these statistics? And the most recent census is the one that's going on in 2020. Look at the population figures from the census years shown in the table below. Using the total population of the Hispanic population, calculate the percentage of Hispanic population for each year. After you calculate the percentage, analyze the differences between census years. For each census year, draw a pie graph that reflects the percentages you calculated. Use your school library or internet to conduct research on the growth of the Hispanic population in the United States since 1980. Write a short report of your findings. These population pyramids show the percentage of the population of each country at each age group by sex. The birth rate of Sweden has been relatively steady decline for a number of years, while Mexico has maintained a high birth rate. So what three factors affect a region's growth of decline in population? The birth rate, the death rate, and the migration rate. Now, let's talk about Malthus. Thomas Malthus proposed the population grew geometrically and would therefore outstrip the ability to feed everybody. It created two checks on population. It's preventative lowering birth rate, so we should have birth control, and positive increasing death rate. War. Malthus failed to foresee advances in agriculture and production and acceptance of birth control. Malthus's doom and gloom theory about food production that frightened many people, and it led to, in part, one of the most notorious theories called eugenics, in where it suddenly became a consideration where people started to think that maybe we should only make sure that the best people survive. The demographic transition theory was the population patterns are tied to a society's level of technological development. Stage one was the pre-industrial birth rate and death rate is high and fairly stable for a population. Stage two is the developing industrial reduced death rate and high birth rate is rapidly growing population. Stage three, the developed industrial reduced birth rate and low death rate are fairly stable population. The demographic transition theory ties population growth to the technological advancement of a country. So examine this graph. Which growth stage in the demographic transition has a high death rate? What happens to a population if the birth rate is lower than the death rate? The population will decrease over time. The world now contains nearly 6.2 billion people, and the population continues to grow. There is concerns about the rapid growth and have led strategies aimed at controlling this growth. Family planning. The conscious decisions by couples to have certain number of children involves using birth control. Birth control was early effective birth control, like the birth control pill, really didn't emerge until the 1960s. And since then, the birth rate in the industrial world has declined dramatically. Some countries offer incentives for small families, such as placing fines on additional children. This has been the practice in both China and India, where the population in those two countries are very high. Uh, Economic improvements. Some critics of family planning believe that the economic development must proceed before people in less developed nations will voluntarily limit their family size. In less developed countries, the larger your family, the better your chances of success. And so, for instance, since they don't have good healthcare systems, you rely on children to take care of you as you get older, since there won't be any kind of pension system. How are some nations controlling population growth? Well, they do it through family planning, programs to promote economic development. I didn't give you enough time on that one. Some sociologists study ways that the movement of populations affects the social world, especially the movement called urbanization. This movement involves the concentration of population in cities. Cities first arose about 6,000 years ago on the fertile banks of major rivers in North Africa and Asia. Many of these early cities were small but modern standards and contained a few thousand people. Most pre-industrial cities were crowded and lacked any kind of sanitation system. As a result, the death rates in these cities were higher than in those in rural areas. The first cities emerged in the Fertile Crescent along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates River in what is modern-day Iraq. They emerged approximately at the same time along the Nile River. In fact, they're so close it's hard to tell which was first, though generally it's considered the Mesopotamian cities of Iraq were the ones that first emerged. And then, of course, later, shortly after that, on the Nile River of Egypt, and then over in Harappan civilization in South Asia, and then the last was over in China along the Honghe River. However, and then of course, much later, Native American civilizations along in Central America. The industrial city was much larger than the pre-industrial city, and commerce was the focal point of urban life. For the first time in history, people worked outside the home and in offices and factories. As industrial cities grew, larger crime, overcrowding, and pollution increased. The main idea of this section is cities have evolved through time and face many challenges today. So you should be able to answer, how did cities evolve, and what are some of the challenges cities face today? Urbanization is the concentration of the population into cities. A city is a permanent concentration of relatively large number of people who are engaged mainly in non-farming activities. The pre-industrial city, the first cities arose about 6,000 years ago and grew because of advances in agriculture. Life in these early cities was crowded and dirty. These cities typically would only be not much larger than 20 or 25,000 people at the most, because that was about all the infrastructure of a city in the pre-industrial world could handle. The Industrial Revolution changed life in cities. Mechanization of agriculture led people to move to the cities. Commerce and society became the focal point of life instead of the family. Most early cities contained religious centers such as the Temple of Ur in present-day Iraq, which has been partially reconstructed above. Over time, each city and the land it controlled formed a city-state, a political unit with its own government. As the city-states grew, they fought over land and water. The main function of the pre-industrial city was to serve as centers of trade. Many pre-industrial cities contained a castle, government buildings, and marketplaces. These cities also had defined boundaries marked by defensive walls, as seen in the painting of Genoa, Italy, the city above. The industrial city. During the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s and early 1900s, cities such as New York and London evolved into major centers of manufacturing. Factories sprung up to meet the high demand in products such as clothing, processed meats, and steel parts. With factories, cities became a magnet for workers and immigrants looking for jobs. The city today, Mexico City, is a prime example of how cities have spread out or sprawled from their centers. This urban sprawl causes excessive pollution and in some cities areas temporarily housing called shanty towns. Cities today, such as Mexico City, are global, or more global than the industrial city was, and now serve as international economic centers. So how did the industrial city differ from the pre-industrial city? The industrial city was larger in area and population. There were central business districts were replaced by parts of the city developed as certain trades, such as the clothing district, the meat market, or the meats, food processing centers, that kind of thing. People worked farther away and from where they lived, and the family became less powerful force in controlling the daily life of the individual. The industrialization led to public transportation as well, which made it possible to live further from your work. So you could take the subway, for instance, and later a bus. Urbanization in more developed countries has usually resulted in increased rates of literacy, greater economic opportunities, and improved health care. When you live in a city, the ability to communicate becomes key. And so schooling and education became key factors in the success of the cities. And of course, with population density, it made it much easier to bring children to school, and especially when the parents were at work. Urbanization in less developed countries, however, has been less orderly and more rapid. In many of the less developed countries, they just kind of spread out as a way of creating work. Over-urbanization is a situation in which more people live in a city than can be supported in terms of jobs and facilities, making inadequate housing, food, sewage disposal, and hospitals, high rates of illness and death. And this can be somewhat seen here in the modern United States, where you have states like California have high homeless populations because they can't afford housing in the success of the communities, where in California real estate is extremely expensive. That's one of the draws to the America and South, is that the land is still largely considered inexpensive and housing still affordable. And so that's why many companies have relocated to the American South. So how do you think urbanization can be prevented? Possible answers are create more job opportunities for people in areas outside of cities so that they will not be drawn into urban areas to find work or services. New York City's ethnic neighborhoods. Centuries of migration and immigration have shaped New York City into hundreds of distinct ethnic neighborhoods that have come to reflect the diverse cultures of these immigrants. Lower East Side is a large population of Jews, is the home of the city's first synagogue. Chinatown street signs are in both English and in Chinese. There are Chinese groceries and restaurants. Jackson Heights is Little India, where there's Bollywood theaters and Indian restaurants, and also home of immigrants from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Russia. Little Italy is not as Italian as it used to be, now more of a tourist destination. Many Italians have moved to Staten Island. Harlem is the center of the African American culture and music in the 1920s and is recently become economically revitalized. Spanish Harlem is a high concentration of Puerto Ricans, and Irish New York, there's about 2 million Irish that migrated in the mid-1800s. So how did New York's ethnic neighborhoods differ? And what influence do you think the immigrants have on the city's culture? Some sociologists developed urban ecology as an approach to studying cities. This approach examines the relationship between people and the urban environment. In addition to studying the structure of cities, sociologists are interested in the nature of life in cities. Several theories try to explain city life. The urban anomy is compositional and subcultural. So the main idea for Section 3, researchers have created several models to explain the structure of cities and several theories to explain city life. So what you should be able to answer at the end of this section is, what models of city structure are there, and how do some theories explain city life? Urban ecology examines the relationship between people and the urban environment. Human behavior determines the layout of the urban environment, and in turn, the urban environment affects human behavior. Areas of a city are created for set purposes, and as a result, people, buildings, and activities are distributed in certain patterns. The concentric zone model, a typical industrial city spreads outward from the center, resulting in a series of circles or zones. Each zone is used differently. Residential areas are constantly changing as a result of the changing zones. Geographical features might change structure. The sector model, growth occurs in the wedge-shaped sectors, not concentric circles. The outward from the center to the edge of the city. Transportation routes are what causes the shape of the city. And then there's the multiple nuclei model. A city grows outward from several centers of activity or nuclei, not just as one. It addresses the use of automobiles in the city. So here again, transportation is a major factor. Clustering occurs because it is beneficial. Several stores grouped together will attract more customers than one single store. And so here is a visual representation of these different styles. Sociologists and geographers studied the land use patterns of the North American cities and created different models of city structure shown below. As you can see, in the colonial period, they used the wagon wheel model, which would be similar to the sector model, in which they would design a circular city with spokes directing the traffic into the center of the city. These three models describe ideal city growth. Conditions are not expected to be exact reflections of any one or all urban areas. They account for previous trends such as suburbanization, but not some recent trends such as urban sprawl. Urban sprawl, poorly planned development on the edge of cities and towns. Downtown residential areas are proposed to be low income in these models, but in reality, downtown areas have become high income residential areas. They ignore emotional ties of a population to a particular location. So what are the models of city structure? The concentric zone, the sector model, and the multiplying nuclei model. Anami means normlessness. Anami means normlessness. This theory was proposed by Lewis Wirth. The city is an anonymous, unfriendly, and living there carries serious negative consequences for residents. Cities discourage primary group relationships, and this lack of primary relationships produces anami. Contact with others is short-lived, formal, and shallow. So for security's sake, in other words, when you live in a city, you only contact people that you have to, and you keep that contact with strangers at a minimum. And as a result, you do not necessarily build the relationships you would in a small town. Compositional theory. The composition of the city's population influences the city life. Age, race, ethnicity, education, income, occupation, affect urban lifestyle. All these are major factors. There are 5 identifiable lifestyles among city dwellers. The subcultural theory, the characteristics of the city encourages primary group relationships. People form groups around interests. Because of the city's size and diversity, people can find others who share their interests and lifestyles. The 22nd century city. What do you think cities will look like in 100 years? Architects and engineers from across the United States tried to answer this question in a competition held in 2008. Competitors from 3 cities, Atlanta, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., attempted to come up with the most interesting, efficient plan for the city of the future. Architects representing the San Francisco team created a city plan based on large, white, geothermal mushrooms in the foreground at the right, and tall, curvy, algae-like harvesting towers in the background. Scattered throughout the city, these geothermal mushrooms would tap into the steam deep in the Earth's crust. The geothermal energy would in turn provide electricity to homes and office buildings. Hydrogen produced by algae harvested in a forest of towers would also generate energy for the city. The hydrogen would be used to power hover cars that would travel through underground tunnels. In addition to algae harvesting, the plans of San Francisco in 2018 called for fog catchers that would harvest the city's famous fog as a water source. Water was also a hot issue for Atlanta. Team of architects and planners. They created an enormous system of underground pipes that would filter the rainwater throughout the city. So think about it and draw conclusions. How do you think the society will be different in the 22nd century? How does subcultural theory describe the formation of relationships? Since there are many people in cities who might share one's interests, there are also more opportunities to form associations and friendships with people. This is why usually you find communities of people who, in a small town, have a hard time finding people like them. They tend to cluster in cities. That's like the homosexual community, for instance. You'll see more of that in a city than you'll see that in a rural community. So tonight, this lab, for this chapter, we want to study world population statistics. So how does the population of the United States differ from population of other countries? So what we'll do first in this lab, you'll analyze the population statistics from the United States and for another country. You should work with a partner to research a country and find statistics for both countries. Compiling statistics and creating a poster. Enter your statistics in a chart. Add your chart and a title to the piece of poster board. Print the population pyramids you found and add those. Finally, add photographs and illustrations that explain the data. With an urban population of 27%, Vietnam is mostly rural. More than half of the country's population works in agriculture. The population of Argentina is 90% urban. The capital of Buenos Aires is home to about 12 million people. So, work with your partner to decide who will present which parts of the poster. Talk about the following: statistic tables, population pyramids, comparing the two countries, explain the illustrations. Of course, you both have to agree what two countries you're going to study. What did you learn from this lab? As a group, discuss the following. What difference and similarities among countries did you find? Do you think the growth rate of a country affects its society? Explain your answer. Which assigned country has the lowest birth rate? Which assigned country has the largest percentage of teenagers? This concludes Chapter 16 on population and urbanization. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's lesson.